The ancient word today is from Luke 4, chapters 14 through 20. Then Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding region. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release of the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were upon him. The contemporary word is called Epiphany Blessing by Jan Richardson. "He is my chosen one, and I am pleased with him. I have put my spirit upon him. He will reveal justice to the nations." Okay. "May the path that Christ walks to bring justice upon the earth, to bring light to those who sit in darkness, to bring out those who live in bondage, to bring new things to all creation. May this path run through our lives. May we be the road Christ takes."
Well, I spent a good part of my reading time this past week back in the 19th century. I'm engaged in a project of learning how did I come to believe the things I believe, to have the kind of Christian faith that I have. One of the things we like to talk about here is no matter where you are on your journey, you are welcome here, and that is true. Whatever your beliefs or non-beliefs, that's not what determines your welcome or our eagerness to get to know you. The faith that I have doesn't fit into what you would call an orthodox box of any particular sort. And yet it shapes my work and my life. I guess what I can I'll just jump in here. It's about the L word. No, not lesbian, although that one is true also, but it's liberal. The kind of theology that I grew up with and that still pervades me is called liberal theology. And this is a kind of theology that began developing in the 18th century as people were beginning to engage in the same kind of scholarly reflection on religion that they had been devoting to science. The beginning of trying to understand things in a rational and observable and shareable way. Observing experience. And by the 19th century, this move, which was trying to reconfigure, to reshape traditional Christian teaching in light of modern knowledge, modern values, And it's interesting, I didn't know this, but it makes sense. One of the attitudes was that genuine Christianity was not based on external authority. Now, it had been thought, certainly since the Protestant Reformation, that Christianity was based entirely on the Bible, which was the external authority. And so this liberal attitude began to say there's more than the Bible that shapes Christianity. Of course, everyone knew that anyway, because we had our history and our various creeds and many other aspects of Christianity. And one of the reasons that this move was being made in theology was to try to counter a move toward atheism amongst a certain set of scientists. An atheistic rationalism, as well as this Christianity based on external authority. So it was an open approach. It was saying, what does our modern way of intellectual inquiry show us about our Christian tradition and about the meaning of Jesus and of God in our time? So individual reason, individual experience were important. Christianity was conceived in many ways as an ethical way of life, that was the place to center. Basically trying to make Christianity credible and socially relevant for modern people. This is very similar to the kind of theology I was talking about back in September. We were talking about church history, and I was talking about how when this church was founded in 1925, that the intention was to create a church that welcomed everyone, and a church that was not based on a particular creed, but a church that recognized the diversity of Christian experience. This is important to me in our current political moment. I'm aware that today is the Sunday of the weekend when we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, when we remember that great social movement of the 20th century for civil rights, a movement that in many respects still continues and certainly has not been completed. It's also, of course, the weekend before the inauguration of our next president, an inauguration that leaves many of us uneasy, wondering what is going to come of the intentions and proclamations of this next president. It's a challenging political moment, no matter where you land on a liberal conservative spectrum. I saw a column by Michael Ignatieff, a political scientist, in the Washington Post this week, and he said, "I was a liberal before I knew what the word meant. I was born a liberal," and he talks about his upbringing in a liberal Canadian family. And he said, we thought that in the 1960s that we had laid a secure foundation. He called it the granite of basic security under everyone's feet. And now that granite is cracking. And he said, liberals are trying to defend against populists and authoritarians who want to take that foundation apart. And in order to do so, they have mobilized resentment. And this, of course, has come at the price of social solidarity. He says, but we have to recognize something about our liberal outlook. He said there's an abyss between the credentialed elite and the uncredentialed majority. There's an abyss because union jobs have been stripped, jobs have been shipped overseas. Those in the credentialed layer or group, people who have formal education and jobs that require skills of certain kinds, have been relatively okay over this last 40, 50, 60 years. But for people who worked with their hands, with their with skills that didn't require that kind of education, this has been a desperate time. Because if we look statistically, we can see that for the great majority of working people, income has not increased over the last 40 years, until this last couple years when there has been some, although not adequate, rise in wages. So as a community, we were vulnerable. The liberal elite, the managers, said, look, everything's great. Look at the stock market. But many people had to say, I work full time and I don't make enough to pay the rent and buy the food and drive my car and clothe my children. So it's been a time when a liberal political conception has been under attack. Ignatieff had a lot to say about some of the other outcomes of all of this. One of them was about the idea of diversity and how diversity began as a value and then it became an ideology used coercively to say, no, you can't say that anymore. An ideology that threatened people as society was changing, as different kinds of people were moving into professional spheres, into social spheres. People from other countries, people of different racial backgrounds, different political, religious backgrounds. LGBTQ plus folks becoming visible. This was an overthrow of the 1960s society in which the granite was set. He says, we need to recover the core of our liberal identity. And this actually aligns pretty consistently with ideas from liberal theology. No accident, I'm sure. This old liberal way of seeing things took an egalitarian outlook and had universal premises. It assumed that whoever we were, we had a capacity for rational thinking, and we could seek to understand others and find ways to build a society together. Liberal also meant generous. In fact, before it meant liberal, it meant generous. So it's a generous individualism is at the core, an openness to new possibilities, and a willingness to learn. a commitment to share whatever wealth and fortune we have, to welcome strangers, to stand up for people in trouble. An ideal of solidarity and a willingness to change our minds. Now, back in 19th century, there was a whole series of theologians who took these ideas on and tried to see what they meant. I found as I was reading it that some of the conflicts that arose because as things became more open, they became less defined. So a liberal preacher was not going to center the proclamation on a fear of hell. But interestingly, what drew people to big gatherings and big revivals was this thunderous fear of hell. It aroused the emotions in a particular way. It's a little bit similar to what we're seeing politically now, I think. And so, what had been the establishment churches, the churches of the elite, essentially, our ancestral churches, the Congregational Church, the Presbyterian Church, parts of the Methodist Church, parts of the Anglican Church, and so on, became less sort of accepted as the overall outlook. Other theologies took prominence as our theologies began to change. And then, of course, toward the end of the century, we had what was called the social gospel. 20th century, liberation theology. Part of the challenge with us here then is to say, well, what might all these ideas say about our scripture today? Because Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee and he went to the synagogues. Now, a lot of times when I imagine a synagogue, I imagine something kind of parallel to this church. And interestingly, it's almost true, because in that time, synagogues were not just places of worship. Synagogues were places where people went, yes, for worship, for study. They went for meals and social events. They went for political gatherings, community discussions. It was where they held their courts. It was where they released people who had been enslaved. It wasn't a building dedicated just to worship. And in that big room where they met, a room that was big enough that it had to actually have columns inside it to hold the roof, there were just benches around the four walls and no religious symbols. Even the Torah to be read on the Sabbath was brought in from a separate small room. So when Annie mentioned to me this week that back in 1932, our own church here at Mill Valley had a conflict because some, now that the church had its own building, wanted to make it just a church. Well, the founders said, no, this is a community church. It is a place for the community to gather and not just for church events. The pews could be taken out so you could have a dance or a meal in here. I think in a way our founder's vision was more like the ancient synagogue than like some of the churches we know. And Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And here he's quoting the prophet Isaiah. actually two parts of Isaiah put together. Anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And this year of the Lord's favor referred to the tradition of the Jubilee, when slaves would be released, when property would be returned, when a relative egalitarianism would be reestablished. Jesus, by saying this, is in effect claiming that he is bringing this. And it's a little bit like what a liberal theology and a liberal philosophy and a liberal politics would wish to claim as well. A relative egalitarianism. Freedom. Freedom, also one of the great liberal values, right? A certain kind of liberty, not liberty to do whatever we want, but liberty to live in a society that is not based only on external authority, but based on our own capacity for reason, for learning, for changing our minds. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and of course they were. This is an outrageous claim. This is shocking that someone would say that this is the good news I bring. In part because Galilee was subject to the rule of Rome, as well as the rule of the temple in Jerusalem, heavily taxed, oppressed politically, forced essentially into poverty because of the way the economic system was set up to favor those who already had something. And if the poor acquired anything that might be a little more than usual, that would be taxed away. This seems like an impossible dream back there in the first century. No wonder they looked at him like that. What are you talking about? Now, in Christianity, there's been a long tradition of focusing our efforts on what Matthew 28 says, which says, spread the gospel to all the nations, baptize everyone. And some have said, no, this is the primary teaching of Jesus, not to baptize everyone, but to bring good news to the poor. And this has been one of the conflicts, political, social, and so on, in the churches and in our politics over this last century. It's not that liberal means Democrat or Republican, because until the 1960s, liberal meant both, just had different ideas of how to achieve this liberty, this relative equality, this justice. And it was after the 60s and 70s when Republicans adopted an ideology that said, move the money to the top and that will create more for everyone. And so they set tax policy in that way. It was like the Roman tax policy. Did it create more wealth for everyone? No. And so this liberal tax policy that we had under Republicans in the 1950s that taxed the most wealthy 90% of their income above a certain level. This long out of view way of taxation becomes more and more appealing as a way to achieve what Jesus is telling us here, to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, set free those who are oppressed. And so there's a question then of our path. Jan Richardson points us to a path of following Jesus. And for some of us, that is one of the ways we choose to live our lives, to follow that path. And if we followed this path, how then might it reshape our individual lives? How might it reshape this communal life here in this congregation? How might it reshape what we believe, what we hold important in the Christian tradition? How might a liberal theology that says there is no single external authority shape our worship and our activities together? We have a lot to think about in the coming years. 100 years this year we've been here. 100 years and a time in the 1950s like so many churches of great growth, and a time in the 2000s like so many churches, a time of people moving away from church. Why do we stay? What is it here that speaks to us so deeply that we get up on Sunday mornings and come to talk and listen and sing, to eat together? What is it? Let's talk about it. Amen.